Not only do we have the DC jail, which is the DC gulag, but now we have Nancy Pelosi's Gazpacho police spying on members of Congress, spying on the legislative work that we do, spying on our staff, and spying on American citizens that want to come talk to their representatives.
So, as you guys saw from that clip, it looks like our good friend Marjorie Taylor Greene learned absolutely nothing from those required visits to the Holocaust museums. Um, you know, uh, there's not much. I just wanted to start with that because every time I see her talk, she says something ridiculous, and sometimes it's not even intentional, but it makes you go, damn, this lady is, I think, the number one Republican fundraiser right now. I think she's going to be a president in 10 years based on how we're going. And she's mixing up the Gestapo with a cold tomato based Spanish soup. I know some people might say, Alex, it's her accent. No, it's not. I've heard some people with southern accents say Gestapo, not Gazpacho. There's a lot of different letters and consonants and vowels in there, but yeah, I would say just to start, Gazpacho is one of my least favorite Spanish foods. When I studied abroad in Sevilla back in 2016, I had a pretty crazy host mom. I actually had to end up changing families while I was there, but she actually forced me to eat gazpacho about every night because I think she knew I didn't like it, and so I would just kind of sit there and force it down, and I just hated it. So yeah, Marjorie Taylor Greene. It's a pretty tame, cold Spanish soup. The Gestapo were a very bad force, secret police during Nazi Germany. I don't think Nancy Pelosi's the Gestapo either way, but thank you guys for joining me today on the Centered for Reality podcast. I am Alex Kapitko, and yeah, to start off today, other than the Gazpacho, President Biden is really not having good news right now. A new poll from Real Clear Politics, which is just kind of an average of all the national surveys and polling found, it basically said that Biden right now has gone below 40% in his approval rating. 39.8% of Americans approve of his performance, while 54.4% disapprove. So basically, Biden's popularity is some of the lowest at this point of a presidency on record. And it's even dropped below that of Trump, who finished his 4 years with about 41.1% aggregate over the 4 years. Obviously, Trump has dropped very low as well, but it's not a good look for Biden, especially going into these midterms, because a lot of polling shows that if the president is polling bad, his own party is also probably going to do bad. It kind of reflects your whole party in general. And just pretty much since late August, Biden has just kind of free fallen, I think would be the better way. He was about 50% in late August, and then the Afghanistan debacle happened. And since then, it's been basically a shit show, pardon my French. And I think this just continuous drop is kind of just a symbol of the chaos in the administration. And I think it showed a lot of us that we were naive to think that Biden could bring us back from the brink, bring us back from the 4 years of chaos under Trump. I'm totally guilty of that. I think I was really hopeful at first that Biden could at least bring us to some semblance of normality, and that is not that is not the case, It's like Biden is losing popularity, I think, because his record of getting things done hasn't been great. And there's the specter of Trump that's always kind of looming in the background, and this radicalism on the right. And they're both getting worse, not better. And the economy's good, but I don't think a lot of Americans actually feel good or like how their lives are going right now. And the pandemic is still happening. Build Back Better didn't get passed, which was kind of center to his agenda. And there's a lot of uncertainty about Ukraine, even though I actually think Biden's handling Ukraine fairly well. But there's just a lot of uncertainty in the air, and Biden's not good at really marketing his accomplishments. I don't really have any idea how Biden at this point can really rehabilitate himself, but I guess in a basic sense, COVID-19 could be that. He needs that kind of mission accomplished energy like Bush had after 9/11 and after the invasion of Iraq. And Biden, I think, needs to kind of come out and say, COVID is behind us. We're going to treat it like it's an endemic level, and we're going to start moving on. I know the virus isn't gone. Still, about 2,500 people a day are dying. But it's mainly unvaccinated and the unhealthy and people with a lot of comorbidities. And, I think we need to start touting these vaccines. They're not perfect, but they're stopping people from dying if you're vaccinated. And if we don't start moving on from COVID now, then what is the milestone we're waiting for? And I think that's part of the disillusionment on the left and within independents as well, and with the right is like, what are we waiting for here? Like Omicron, yeah, a lot of people are still dying from Omicron, but like I said, it's mainly unvaccinated. Omicron seems to be less deadly, and we're past the peak. People are sick of it. I think it's time. We've seen Denmark and the UK, just to name a few examples. They're completely moving on, and I think it's time to start doing that. So maybe Biden needs to embrace that. And so I am happy to announce that Democratic governors are catching up with the American sentiment. The CDC and the Biden administration are still behind, but it does look like we're going to start saying adios to mask mandates, and I think that's going to be maybe helpful for Democrats going into the midterms. The New York Times wrote yesterday, in quotes here, that several states are moving to the eliminate mask mandate phase as coronavirus cases are dipping to their lowest since December. And just to name a few states, we have California, February 15th, indoor mask mandate is expiring, so yay. Of course, I'm in Illinois as California is getting this going, so I'm kind of jealous because Illinois is waiting till February 28th. And honestly, by the way, the streets are here. I'm just looking out my window right now. I would say probably 3 out of 4 or 4 out of 5 people I see passing by are wearing a mask outside by themselves. So I don't even know. February 28th, Illinois is lifting their mask mandate. I still think people are going to wear them around here. It's kind of just a group mentality at this point here. I don't get it. I'm ready to just strip that thing off, but a lot of people have just kind of bought into wearing it. So who knows? Connecticut, February 28th as well. Nevada today or yesterday. Oregon, March 31st, which is very far away, so I don't understand that. New Jersey, the second week of March, long ways. And New York, Rhode Island, Pennsylvania, and Virginia as well. So I'm glad this is happening. At this point, I don't think that, 15% of Americans that are not vaccinated, I don't think they're ever going to get vaccinated. It's the unvaccinated, like I said many times. I keep beating it across the head here that it's the unvaccinated that are dying, mainly. And I don't think we're going to convince some of those people to get vaccinated. So I think it's time to be about assessing your own risk here and going with that. I'm triple vaccinated. I've had COVID. I've been eating indoors in restaurants. I've been going to sports events. I've been going to bars. I've been flying. And that's a risk I'm willing to take. I'm young and I run a lot and I try to eat well, and I want to get back to a semblance of normality. I think if people still want to wear masks, avoid eating in packed places, go for it. It's like we need to start moving on, and I hope that the Democrats stick with this, because it looks like a lot of states are going, hey, people are getting fatigued of this and we need to move on. So it's probably for political reasons, but whatever it takes, I'm just glad to see it happening. Sorry, but I want to spend the majority of this episode talking about kind of two things here now. So I want to start by looking at how Democrats are losing their appeal in rural America, which should be a secret to no one. And then also maybe how they can get that appeal back, looking at kind of digital equality. And Ro Khanna from California, congressman from Silicon Valley, has some interesting ideas. And they're kind of getting some steam, bipartisan steam, in Congress and in the White House. And then I want to look at local elections that are coming to Uttar Pradesh in India. And they are the largest local elections taking place in the world. And many experts think that they are going to show us where India is headed, because India is grappling with this growing authoritarianism and ethnic division. So it's going to be interesting. I want to start with what the Democratic Senator Jon Tester said. He's from Montana. He's also a farmer. Fascinating guy. I've always been a fan of him, but I think it was yesterday that he made some interesting comments that I completely agree with. He is one of those more moderate Democrats from a red state that I think needs to be valued and listened to more in his own party, because I want to hear from a Democrat that can win in a highly Republican state. I think there's a lot of value to come from their perspective. Even if you don't agree with it, to win over people in a red state tells me you're doing something right. Anyways, according to this CNN article I'm just getting for background, Jon Tester criticized fellow Democrats for not appealing to middle America and said Democrats need to show up in these places if they want to win elections. And David Axelrod on his podcast had Tester on, and Tester said, in quotes here, "I honestly don't think the Democratic Party can be a majority party unless we start appealing to middle America a lot more. I'm talking about the area between the two mountain ranges, the Appalachians and the Rocky Mountains. And if we're able to do that, I think we'll be able to be successful," end quotes. He continued to say, "It's toxic. The National Democratic brand I think in rural America, is generally toxic. And it's because, quite frankly, we don't show up. We're not willing to go to places we're not wanted and answer questions," end quotes. And I think this is a good point and an important one. A lot of people seem to kind of just accept Trump because he didn't care or give a crap about the establishment, and he was willing to listen to people. He did rallies in these areas that a lot of Democrats would never go to. And people felt like they were being heard. You know, for too long, these politicians seemed to ignore the needs and demands of average people. I think Trump was kind of a Hail Mary in a sense. You know, if you're a voter who feels like parts of the country have kind of moved on from you or have dismissed you, you're probably just willing to say, what the hell, why don't we give Trump a try? Like, nothing else has worked. And obviously, I think there's a lot of rhetoric that Trump used that is hateful, dangerous. January 6th obviously was kind of the culmination of Trump's rhetoric. But I think I don't know if we had to get there. If maybe a long time ago, our coastal cities that have really prospered off of this new era of tech and globalization, if they were willing to kind of say, why don't we spread some of this to parts of the country that have been left behind with this new era of globalization? But they haven't, and I think Trump was the outcome. But anyways, I think Tester's comments are spot on, and I wish more Democrats had this kind of willingness to look internally. Obviously, the midterms are not looking great for the Democrats. Now, the Republicans are trying to sabotage that at any point possible with this January 6th stuff and Trump's rhetoric about pardons. But I think it may be too late this cycle for the Democrats to really improve. I mean, we're getting so close and Biden keeps stalling. But I think the Democratic Party actually during COVID has gone even further in the direction of the party of being the urban, educated population who supported COVID restrictions and, you know, could work from home during them and were fine working remotely, and they didn't really worry about these restrictions. And I think this disconnect has also made the Democrats out of touch with a lot of how America's doing. And it's not downplaying COVID, but deaths of despair in a lot of middle America and the South have skyrocketed during the pandemic. And a lot of people were against restrictions and lockdowns because they couldn't stay home. So I think this is partly why Democrats are easing these mask mandates and restrictions, because they're understanding that the politics of them have left a lot of blind spots. But it seems like in a lot of these coastal cities and just big cities throughout the U.S., the people that mainly vote Democrat are seeing the rewards of the digital era, right, of globalization and of the new world economy. They're thriving. But there's a significant portion that's kind of been left behind in another era. And I think that's where a lot of this anger and resentment for the coastal parts is coming from. You know, they never got a piece of this new revolution. It's, I guess in a way, it's like the same technologies that made them wealthy and successful have also broken the older industries in the South and Middle America. You know, so some people are doing great and other people are actually doing awful because of these same technologies. And that's where you kind of have this two Americas coming out of it, right? And so I think Tester's correct here, is we need someone to start trying to bridge these cultural divides, because they're there for a reason, and I think it's mainly economics, but they're just coming out in culture, and that's where we're really seeing them. And last week, of all things, I was watching Bill Maher, who I think is one of the only good late-night talk show people left. But he had on Ro Khanna, who's the congressman representing Silicon Valley in California. And before he was a congressman, Ro Khanna was an intellectual property, an intellectual property attorney who taught economics at Stanford as well. And, he's in California's 17th district, Facebook, Apple, Intel. So you would think he'd be in the pocket of all these companies, but he's really not. And he had an interesting idea on the show. They couldn't go into too much detail just because of time constraints, but so I decided to look into his idea, but it was basically this idea of dignity in a digital age, and it turns out Ro Khanna has a book about it as well. And I've just ordered it because I really want to read it, but the book is kind of centered, and the conversation on Bill Maher was kind of centered on how to break the digital divide in the United States. And I think that's really what has siloed America into these sectors right now in a way. And in this book, Khanna basically talks about how there is skill, desire, and drive for embracing the tech sector all around the country, in places like Kentucky and Iowa and West Virginia as well. But he thinks the opportunities and the infrastructure are lacking because a lot of these giant tech companies haven't, either from not willingness or just because they can't, they haven't expanded into parts of the country where there's a lot of people that could work in these fields. And this is where Khanna thinks that we could really bridge this gap. There's a good interview in The Guardian where Khanna discusses his perspective coming from Silicon Valley. He says in quotes here, "In my district, young people wake up optimistic about the future. There's $11 trillion in market value in the district and surrounding areas. But for many working class Americans across the country, globalization has not worked. It's meant jobs going offshore. It means the shuttering of communities, and it means that their kids have to leave their hometowns. We need to figure out how to bring economic opportunity for the modern world to these communities that have been left out," end quotes. And it's an interesting perspective as well that I wish more people in tech would recognize, He says that Silicon Valley has almost a responsibility to address this inequality that it's created. He even argues that tech companies would benefit from a diversity of talent and lower costs of living if they were to go into other places outside of just, the big cities like Silicon Valley and San Francisco and, Austin, Texas, New York, Illinois, Chicago, not New York, Illinois, New York, Chicago, Illinois, etc. You guys know what I mean, is that it seems like most of the tech industries have been concentrated in areas, and so there's no real potential for people in other areas to get a piece of this pie. Amazon's not even totally tech anymore. Obviously, their cloud services are, and their web services, but Amazon, I remember, was going around the country, for example, touting all these cities as the next one they were going to build their giant headquarters in, and they ended up going to New York after all. There were so many places in the old Rust Belt that would have loved and done well and thrived with Amazon going there, but they didn't. But I like this idea of having these companies start actually outsourcing some of their manufacturing and technology manufacturing and industries to places that need jobs. I think it makes sense. And I'll stop for a moment and just add that it's a very different perspective from what other Democrats I've seen have on this issue. I just remember the arrogant rhetoric around whether these people in rural areas need to learn how to code or move on, need to evolve, stop doing coal, learn how to code. And it seems like Khanna doesn't want to start making people completely revamp their careers late in their lives. Instead, he wants us to start making these tech components in other places where people already have manufacturing experience. That makes perfect sense to me. Not every tech job needs coding or engineering skills or math. Many require just manufacturing still, factory production. And there's people that can do that, right? So it's still kind of vague, but I think it's possible. The centerpiece of what Khanna wants to do is basically put federal and private investment into research, manufacturing, and workforce development, to name a few. And that's not that difficult. the federal government already subsidizes so many factors and so many different industries in the United States. The difference here is that instead of subsidizing maybe dying industries or trying to keep them afloat, why don't we put money in retraining a workforce in industries that are actually booming and are actually lacking in workforce, right? So like the example they give is building a hub of lumber technology in eastern Washington state, for example. Then you subsidize contracting or give tax incentives to private industries to employ local workers, right? So the idea would be to kind of emphasize regional expertise and then develop tech hubs wherever that may be. And we're starting to see that already in parts of the United States. But like I think of West Virginia, for example. Coal is still obviously a small part of our industry for energy in the United States, right? But it's dying. But there's a lot of people still needing jobs from coal. So, West Virginia, why don't we start like moving those jobs, training them, and putting them into other tech hubs that aren't dying but are expanding and don't even have enough people? Also, Khanna's plans, from what I've gathered in the book, are to just institute training programs at historically black colleges. That could check some boxes for the more, identitarian side of the left. And also expand STEM, which is science, technology, engineering, and mathematics in public schools. So put more funding into that, especially in places where maybe the education system needs a revamp. Again, I'm thinking of West Virginia, Kentucky, Iowa, just to name a few. And so this is called the Endless Frontier Act. And honestly, I think it could really help. And some of this stuff, like investing in public schools, regional expertise, incentivizing contractors to employ local workers, building these manufacturing hubs for tech, that all kind of goes into quasi-infrastructure. And I know Biden did pass that infrastructure bill. So maybe, something could fit in there. I also think that this could really help with some of the resentment that Trumpism brought to the surface, that not everyone flourished from this globalized tech boom. And I think this could just help spread growth out across the country. And I just think there's no reason to not expand because our country's always historically been good at manufacturing. And also we've clearly been at the forefront of the technology boom. I think we can mix those. And it's also interesting because in Congress, Khanna is right now a member of the Congressional Antitrust Caucus, and he was the co-chair of Bernie Sanders' 2020 presidential campaign. He's a fascinating guy. I don't agree with all of his politics, but I do like the idea of this. He also backs regulatory and privacy reform on tech firms. And in late January, actually, this is a weird one, Amy Klobuchar and Chuck Grassley introduced a bipartisan law to stop tech platforms from disadvantaging smaller rivals. And Khanna says this is definitely a promising step. And there's the America Innovation and Choice Online Act, which I guess is also part of this. And it was voted out of committee this month on a bipartisan vote of 16-6. Also I guess also the time for this is right because China is, becoming less and less of an ideal trading partner and less of an ideal friend to the United States. We've seen supply chain issues from the pandemic, and it's kind of just showed us how fragile our current globalized framework is. And I think rising populism has shown us that people need to get a share of the digital age or they're going to feel lost and angry. And I think ideas like this kind of could check all those boxes. And it looks like the Biden administration is actually interested in this idea. And in late January, House Democrats have touted a bill that aims to make the U.S. more competitive with China by strengthening technology, manufacturing, and research. I guess incentives for producing computer chips as well. This stuff is great, honestly. We've had all these issues with silicon chips, right? That pretty much go into the majority of all the technology we use. One way to, I think, address that would be having us make them here in West Virginia, right? So, I think the U.S. has stuck in our head that we're losing our jobs because the world's changing and it's cheaper to buy goods from China. That's correct. But at the same time, we can still make good products. And I think right now there's a bigger demand for that after what we've seen with supply chain issues, right? Like my grandparents, for example, they got a new car. a new truck. And they've been waiting, I think, about 6 months now just to get the truck because it's missing half of its pieces, because Taiwan is one of the only places that makes these chips that are necessary for the new components of the trucks. And so what if we could cut out the middleman and make those chips here? I think there's a lot of growing pains with this new globalized digital world, but if we could find a way to address it, and that's going to mean using government to do it, I think we could maybe alleviate some of this cultural division that we're seeing. We don't agree on anything in politics right now because of the culture war, how it's pressed into almost every aspect of politics. And I think if we can find any bipartisan issue that can help us alleviate this cultural divide, we need to take it. And I think this one is that. And it's also just good. I think it could lift a lot of people out of poverty. So we should work on it. Anyways, I do want to move on to talking about the elections in Uttar Pradesh, which is the biggest, or one of the biggest states in India. I don't talk about India much, but for those who don't know, it is the largest democracy in the world and is also at the same time a country of growing contradictions and growing issues. It is divided into ethnic groups, its class system is outdated, and there's not really much upward mobility, and poverty is rampant. Also, the country is run by Prime Minister Narendra Modi, who is in his second term, I believe, and he is definitely a Hindu nationalist, and he's part of that BJP party. I apologize for not pronouncing the full name, but up front, I really have issues with it, and I just don't want to butcher it, so I think we're just going to call it the BJP party, but it's the Hindu nationalist party that got Modi to power. Anyways, Modi is one of the leaders that has kind of taken advantage of this factionalism in society and growing ethnic tensions, growing ethnic divisions. And his rhetoric has been on the border of being Islamophobic, fear-mongering about the threats from the Islamic community. He is one of these leaders that has kind of perfected the us versus them dynamics inside of the country. To him, the Hindu population in India is kind of the sons of their soil, or the true Indian population, the ones who have rightful ownership of the land. It's a very nationalistic view, and he has used that rhetoric to kind of make the population think that their status and security in society are being threatened by others, like the untouchables and the Islamic population. And basically, to sum it up, he is slowly devolving into an illiberal populist. His rhetoric in some ways, I think, mirrors a lot of the other ones we see, like the Trumps and the Bolsonaros, Dutertes. It's kind of this ethnic nationalism that just uses grievance to turn people on each other. And I think Modi is one of the most dangerous ones because his population is like 80% Hindu. So that's a large number to turn against small ethnic groups. But Prime Minister Modi and other allies in his party, the BJP, have basically decided to create an Indian state that is beneficial for that 80%, yet not for the other 20%. And there's a great article from The Economist this week, and it says here in quotes, Modi wants to complete his refashioning of India into a Hindu Rashtra, a state whose defining feature is not the diversity of its citizens, but the faith of its 80% Hindu majority. His ideology of Hindutva is the BJP's reason for being, and Mr. Modi has been pursuing it in an increasingly authoritarian manner. End quotes. So like we have seen all too frequently, Mr. Modi has decided to use fear of the other and ethnic fragmentation to create a society that protects those he deems real Indians, basically. And over the last decade, India has kind of been caught in that zone I talked about last week between democracy and autocracy. And, that's kind of led to them running on a very law and order type of campaign. It's obviously one-sided. It's like law and order for the Hindus, bullying and almost like threats of fear to the others. But the reason I'm bringing this up is because yesterday, February 10th, was the opening day for the largest sub-national elections in the world. And these are taking place in Uttar Pradesh, which is the stronghold of the BJP support that allowed Modi to gain power and allowed Hindu nationalism to flourish. Like, it's a very conservative state in India. And To put it into perspective, though, Uttar Pradesh has the Taj Mahal. It goes all the way up to the Nepalese border. And it's actually a bit larger than the UK and about 3.5 times as populous. So it's a stronghold for this Hindu nationalism. And this election is going to be very interesting because basically it's going to determine how the BJP and Modi do and how well they can run their campaign in the country, basically. You know, if Uttar Pradesh were to lose a significant amount of seats, for example, in this election, which happens from February 10th to March 10th, it would throw Mr. Modi's re-election into doubt in 2024. And I guess for me, I hope that the population does stand up and that there are opposition parties that could defeat at least some of those seats, because I don't like what the BJP is doing. And I think for a country that's so diverse and giant as India, bad things could really come quickly out of that. To add more context to this region, before we go into the election, Uttar Pradesh is governed by this very pragmatic and loving man, I'm being sarcastic if you can't see my expression, named Yogi Adityanath. Again, sorry if I'm messing up his name. He's I know I describe Modi as a fundamentalist, but this guy's much more of a fundamentalist. The Economist notes that, in quotes, in one speech he declared, "If they take one Hindu girl, we will take 100 Muslim girls." Nice. In 2017, when the BJP took power in Uttar Pradesh, some even warned Modi, who's not a moderate, that putting an extremist like Adityanath into power would damage the party's image. But apparently Modi didn't care, and this guy's been running Uttar Pradesh, and he's done it quite well. The party's actually flourished. He's divided society and kind of created more fear than ever before, but the party seems to be doing well. And it's probably because he's just created answers to some of the fears that they've also created. He's taken a very tough stance on law and order. I saw that respect for the law has not gone up, though, which is unfortunate. And it just looks like it's angered a lot of the non-Hindu parts of the region. The Economist notes that in the Muslim community, which makes up 19% of Uttar Pradesh's population, and amongst the Dalites, once known as untouchables, there is little love for the tough measures. And apparently there's videos of police beating up protesters, usually Muslims. There's talk about how, like, Muslim men are always perpetrators of rape, and to protect Muslim women, we need to, control Muslim men. Very, very Islamophobic rhetoric, and it seems to be just getting kind of worse and more escalated, and the policies, or actually helping people, seems to be going down. And leading up to this election, also there is just dissatisfaction inside of the country, because it looks like to me the BJP has kind of been focused on rhetoric and dividing the region and making sure that they can have a Hindu stronghold, but they haven't actually delivered any actual tangible goods here. The BJP has always campaigned on prosperity for all. But the pandemic has led to crazy inflation, health issues, a lot of deaths. India is a packed country, so COVID, a respiratory disease, is not particularly good in a place like that. And also you have just high poverty, high inequality, and apparently really low youth unemployment. Really low youth employment, excuse me. And there are groups that have grown resistant. And of course, as I think resistance has grown and more people are talking about running against these candidates, the rhetoric of stoking racial hate and resentment has grown. And so it seems like divide and conquer is kind of their goal at this point. Like, again, I'm just overgeneralizing that, but it does seem like that's the case. Now, why this election is interesting, I think it goes to March 10th. And even some lower income Hindus are less than in love with their current political situation. Apparently Uttar Pradesh's leader had promised for vikas, which, from what I've gathered from Wikipedia, are development, building broad highways, medical colleges, and high-tech defense corridors. Yet nothing has happened. And there's a part in The Economist that talks about how they talked to a farmer outside of urban Uttar Pradesh, and he talks about, where are these vikas? He's like, look at the crumbling streets around me. I'm living in mud. What have they done other than stoke, racial and ethnic and religious resentment? And also, I think part of the reason why disillusionment's growing is because last year, or maybe even 2 years ago now, time is not real anymore, but there were those protests because Modi's government passed those just insane agricultural laws. I encourage people to look more up of those online, but basically, so you have like rural Uttar Pradesh that seems to be a little bit dissatisfied. Side note, I find this interesting because around the world, it seems like the majority of these conservative movements that have gone kind of populist, they've kind of given up on implementing policy or change. It seems to be class and ethnic division. Just divisive rhetoric, but nothing involved with governing. It's like governing by dividing. And it fascinates me because you can just draw a line between all these countries that have populist governments, and it's like they've just given up on policy a long time ago. And it's going to backfire eventually, or they're going to have to clamp down on human rights. Either way, eventually you're going to have to switch things up, but that's a whole other story. So anyways, in Uttar Pradesh, back to the election. So now you kind of understand it's a conservative society, very stoked by racial tensions, but people are getting dissatisfied because the government really hasn't delivered much. And the BJP does hold 303 out of 403 elected seats, but experts are watching this election that started yesterday because they do think that due to the pandemic, seats could be lost and people are, feeling the promises haven't been kept. And there's a publication I was reading today called Indian Express, and it said that Uttar Pradesh already recorded 60.5% voter turnout, which is pretty high apparently. And there's also been glitches reported from booths, so we could also see maybe some fraudulent claims. It'd be interesting to see, with Trump and Bolsonaro and that Peruvian president whose name I'm forgetting, all calling fraud in their elections. I wonder if we could see that happening in this election too. But the article also thinks that there's a decent chance that the BJP could lose significant seats. It says the fiercely contested first round, where the ruling BJP could face a stiff challenge from the resurgent alliance of Samajwadi Party and the Rashtriya Lok Dal, will test the impact of the farmers' stir and other dissatisfactions. I will also note that reading through this article, apparently Modi has said that if you don't vote for their party, you're voting for acts against women. It's a lot to unpack there, but I think it's assuming that Muslim men are not good to women, so to protect Muslim women, you need to vote against them, something like that. I don't know. There's a lot to unpack there. But anyways, this election may determine what happens to the political order in India. It looks like the BJP is going more and more radical and less democratic. Ethnic violence could be on the rise if they maintain this rhetoric, because it never ends good when you divide up society like that and fragment it and play off these groups. The Economist doesn't think that the BJP is going to lose enough seats to actually feel an impact, but it does say this: the near-term impact of a defeat for the BJP when the votes are counted on March 10th would be limited, because state electors get a vote on who becomes president. Fewer BJP legislatures would make it less likely for that vote, which will take place in July, to produce a president aligned with the party. A true dubbing would throw Mr. Modi's re-election in 2024 into doubt. So I guess the issue with this is that the opposition is always pretty fragmented. It makes sense. When you have an 80% majority in the country, probably that other 20% is going to be a lot of different small groups. So that's the issue. They're probably fragmented, and the BJP will maintain power. But India is not on the top of my list of healthy democracies right now. And I would really like to see an upset here, but it's probably not going to happen. But anyways, I want to thank you guys for listening. Have a great weekend, and I'll be back next week. Take care.